Okay. Hello. Yes, I work for the Network Operations Centre in London for Janet, which I'm sure everyone knows is basically the service provider for the research and academic communities. This talk is, I was originally going to call something like More Fun with SSH Config, although I don't want to overpromise on the fun bit. This is partly being based upon a talk I did last year about how to protect passphrase-less SSH keys. And from some of the feedback I got, some people said it was useful to know about some fairly introductory but perhaps not quite obvious options that you can do in the config for SSH and SSHD. So I thought I'd expand on that a bit for today's talk. So yeah, we're going to be looking at some options that you can add into the user's own SSH config file. Some things you can do in the authorized keys file, which is obviously on the target machine that you're SSHing into, and some things you can change or add to the SSHD config, again on the target machine that you're connecting into. Okay. Most of the examples I did on a Debian box, but it should work on anything that's sort of Red Hat based or FreeBSD or Solaris, or I believe MacOS, although I've never tested it on that, but apparently you can run Bash, etc. Right. Okay, to start off with, these are some options, some fairly simple but useful configuration options you can use from the client end, which simplify the syntax for connecting and save you having to remember options, etc. Now, I don't know if you can read that. This is a fairly long command for connecting to a fictitious server called York. So here you're saying that you want to allow X11 forwarding, assuming that's allowed at the other end. You're just turning the verbosity level up to level 1, and you're logging in as a user called Bill. And you would like to use, this is I for identity file, you would like to use a private key, which you've got in your home directory, which is called York key, and you would like to connect to the IPv4 address of the server, assuming you've got a choice. And this is the host name, that's the user sorry, that should be a dot, I just realized. But anyway, that's the name of the server that you want to connect to. So instead of having to remember, you could probably set up an alias for that if you were going to do it regularly. But it's a bit more portable and clean to edit your SSH config file in your home directory. So in the SSH directory in your home. This doesn't exist on a fresh install, so you have to create it. And it will override the system-wide client defaults. So this is for machines connecting from the host, which are held in etc ssh underscore config. Did I put a config? No, I didn't. You can look in that file. Nearly everything in it is commented out, but they are actually the defaults. So if they're commented out, they're not disabled. They are just there to remind you what they could be if you decided to override them. Let's have a look. Yeah, and if you're trying to set these up and you're trying to work out which file it's actually reading your settings from, if you're not sure, it basically runs in this order of precedence. So first of all, it'll take whatever you put on so the highest precedence will go to whatever you type on the command line. Then it will look in your user-specific file, and then it will look in the system-wide file, which I say is generally fairly sparsely populated. Okay, so basically the things you can do in this file is to set up host aliases, which saves you from remembering all of the configuration that we were putting onto the command line in the earlier example. These are basically just text labels, but and they don't have to they don't have to correspond directly to the host name. You can set them on whatever mnemonic you find useful. So in this case, we would start the section. They're effectively each section starts with a host declaration. So in this case, going back to the earlier example, we were connecting to a fictitious host called York. You start the section with host York, and at the simplest level, you just give it a host name. which I've typed correctly this time. So that could just be a raw IP address if you're testing something and you haven't set up the DNS yet. Or for some reason you've got two different machines and one of them's masquerading as another. Yes, the other thing is that if your username on the local machine happens to be the same as the one on the remote machine, that's not a problem. But you may have some functional users that you've set up that you SSH into for running particular tasks, not as yourself, or you have some low privileged users that you set up. So if you want to do that on the command line, you would the old-fashioned canonical way of doing that would be to say L for login, give the username and give the host name. Or slightly more usually, people tend to put the username at the host name, which is more familiar format.
You have with Debbie, if you install the bash completion package, you can have complete host names with SSH.
Yeah.
Which is very handy for this.
Okay, so a fairly simple thing you can do is to specify the user that's tied to that host. And we'll look at a bit later on having a default user and overriding that with different host declarations. So now, if you type SSH York, it will assume the host name, the username that you've given it, and it will know the full path to the server, unless you've got completion anyway. So you can, although they are simple labels, you can have more than one alias that points to the same host. So supposing York happens to be your web server, or you've got some other convenient way of remembering it, or maybe you have it has an internal name that you like to that follows some kind of convention that you're using, but you want a more convenient way of referring to it. So you can just separate these by commas. Let's have a look. Yeah, so you may have another host that has a different username, so you can override that here. Yeah, so we've now got a different host called Brighton. These are named after cities that have hosted conferences. Right. So there's other things you can override. If some of your servers, for whatever reason, are running on different ports, you could specify this on the command line, but there's a good chance that you'll eventually forget that you've done that if it's not a host you use regularly. So you can specify the port. These commands all follow one after another in a real file. So you would have the user and the port all following on from each other. The convention is usually to indent these, but that's not actually significant. It's just looking for the next host declaration. Yeah, another thing you could do if you're using an SSH key to connect, and you're not using, or for maybe because you don't think it's secure, you're not using an agent, you can specify which key to load for each host. And you may turn on, you might want to turn on agent forwarding for some users and not for some hosts and not for others. Although there are some, depending on your environment, you may think it's, you may trust the machine because you run it, the target host, and you may want to allow agent forwarding for convenience. But if it's to machines that you don't have personal control over, you may wish not to do that because there are some dangers inherent with using agents. And you can override the protocol that you use if you've got an older machine. It's fairly unusual nowadays that you find a machine that still offers out Protocol 1, but it's not impossible, and you can override it here if you have to. Yes, if you've got some hosts that are dual stack and some that are only running one stack, you can override which IP version it uses. So in this case, it would be IPv4. I think the default is for it to try v6 first and then drop back to v4. So if you've got some intermittent problem where you're not able to connect to the v6 address for some reason, you could temporarily override this here just to speed up the connection so it doesn't go through the delay of failing to connect to the v6 address. You may wish to turn off key authentication. If you've got a server where you're you have to use for whatever reason you're logging in using password authentication, and you don't want the delay of it trying some of the keys that you may have loaded into your agent, or whatever reason, you can turn off the public key authentication. And to save you having to remember, if you've got a machine that you're running some graphical-based things tunneled over X11, you may wish to put this into the host declaration to save you having to remember to put the -X on the command line. That's assuming that you've decided that's safe in your particular environment. Yes, if you've got a host that you're connecting to via a router that periodically drops idle connections, and that's becoming annoying, you can add this stanza, which will in this case, it will send a keep alive every 2 minutes, just so to stop the connection dropping. Depending on how often the router or whatever would drop the connection and consider it idle. Yes, you can. So far, we've just specified servers by name. You can use wildcards. Now, if you had several hosts in one particular domain, or they shared a common naming scheme, you don't have to have the completely blank wildcard. You can specify so it matches. So you've got a group of hosts where you have a particular user. You can use it for that. But common cases, if you use the host star, you can then, let's say most of your machines have one username, but you have a few where it's different for whatever reason, because I don't know, you're using some functional account. You can set up effectively a default, although as we'll see later on, this is it's tempting to put this at the beginning and have it as a default and then override it later on. But the precedence actually works the other way around. So this is actually for the you should have the more specific cases first. I found reading the man page the other day. Yes, here we go. So any configuration is only changed the first time it's set. So you need to get the order the right way around. Yeah. So this is just from the man page. So the specific things need to be at the beginning. So if we then connect to this server York, we could actually have overridden, if we were always going to connect with the verbosity set on, we could have overridden that in the file as well, but in this case I didn't. So we can see that it makes the connection, and in this case you can see I have actually got these the wrong way around, so it applies the options for matching the wildcard at the beginning, and then it applies the options for the specific server that we've told it to use. There we go. Yeah, and then this is a successful connection, so there's not too much to see here. Okay, so those are the options you can use in your config file, which are really just a convenience. I mean, there are other ways you could achieve this, but it's useful and it saves you having to remember quite complicated commands, or especially for hosts you don't access that often that you might forget about. So the next thing you might want there are some extra options for you that are not everyone's aware of, is if you're using keys to connect to a remote server, you may wish to control the way in which those keys are used. Generally, I tend to use keys rather than passwords because of the fact that it's two parts to it. I know there are people who say that because you can create passphraseless keys, that passwords are safer because you've got control at the server end. But the fact that it's not possible to audit unless you've got access to the client machines. It's not possible to audit whether people are using weak passphrases or none at all. But I think in general the benefits of keys outweigh the disadvantages. So what we would do on the target machine, there's a file in the home directory of the target user called authorized_keys. There's a tool provided for installing the public part of your key pair onto the machine, which is sorry, we haven't come to that yet. So if you're going to generate a key, it's SSH Copy ID. If you don't specify a file name, it will create a file called ID underscore DSA or ID underscore RSA, dependent on which cipher you're using. But I just find, especially if you regularly clean out old keys or unused keys, or you create keys for specific purposes, it's easier to remember what they were for if you give them a sensible name, although you cannot add a comment, which I think we'll cover later. I didn't actually specify the key length or anything to use, but I think the default now is RSA 2048, which is probably secure for most purposes at the moment, I would think. But you can increase that if you're worried, although obviously there's an overhead in generating a larger key. So in this case, it's prompted for the passphrase. Again, it's possible to create them without passphrases, which there are legitimate reasons for doing that if you're automating connections for backups or for polling or for remote graphing or whatever. And you end up with two files, which is you end up with the private key, which is the original name that you gave it, and then you get another file which has the extension .pub on the end, which is the public key. It's important to check that the private key is only readable by yourself or by the user that created it, and there are ways that there is a method on the server end for checking that has been set correctly, and refusing to use the key if it hasn't. Okay, so this is a public key. So at the beginning it tells you what type it is. This is an RSA key. Then you have the actual string itself. I mean, this is the public one, so it's you can. There's no harm in publishing this. It's the private one that never leaves the machine. It's quite simple to generate new keys, so it's good to discourage users from copying them around between hosts. There's no real need to do that. And this one, the default, after the main part of the string, you end up with a comment, and the default for that is just to be the username at the host that it was created on. But you can override that, and this is just a text string. You can edit it after the fact, and there are also tools within SSH Copy for reloading an existing key and changing the comment. Okay, yeah, so the default comment is just the user at the host, which is still useful because you know where it was generated and who by. Okay, there is a tool provided for installing this onto the remote machine. So having generated it on your local host, you can then use SSH Copy ID. And you tell it the path to the key file, which it refers to as an identity file, which is why it's -i. And then you give it the server name at the end, or the remote host name at the end. So that will prompt you for the password at this point, unless you've already got another key loaded. And it will transfer the key across. It just copies it. It copies it across. One advantage of using this, if it's a brand new host, is it will create the .ssh directory for you and set the permissions correctly. And it does print a nice little warning at the end to tell you that you ought to go and check the file manually to make sure it hasn't done anything you didn't think it was going to do. So yeah, the file that it actually copies it to on the remote machine is called is in your home directory called .ssh authorized _keys. By default, this just contains the bare public keys, but you can add options to the beginning of each of these lines. They must be on the same line as the key that they apply to, and they're separated from one another by commas. So one of the most useful things you can do is you can add a from clause to the beginning of each key, which allows you to control which hosts that key will be accepted from. So this is useful if it's a functional key and you're connecting from one host to another in order to run backups or run your monitoring scripts or whatever. You can set up a key that's just for that one purpose and make sure it's not usable from anywhere else. So you can use the raw IP address. You can specify masks if you've got blocks that you want to allow in. You can use v6 addresses as well. and you can combine them as well. And within the list of addresses needs to be quoted itself, and you can separate them with commas. Right. So, and you can use resolvable domain names as well, which it's safe if you're confident that the DNS is under your control, and you can. But it may be, if you might feel more comfortable just using the raw addresses if you're not sure that that's the case. And you can do some wildcarding. So if you want to allow anything from a particular domain to use that key, you can use the wildcard. And you can do some negating as well. So you could say that you trust most of this domain, but not this particular host. This may just be a functional host that's got no business connecting to it. You can also control what's the user is allowed to do once it's connected using the key. So in this case, you might decide that you don't, although you're allowing you're happy for the user to connect into that particular host, you don't want it to be able to hop any further if it's got an agent loaded. So you can use this command to not allow any further agent forwarding. Similarly, if you don't want it to allow it to forward any ports on the remote machine, you can say that key isn't allowed to do port forwarding. These are all on the same line, instantly separated by commas. In this case, if you've got a purely functional account that you've set up for a particular purpose, you might decide it doesn't need an interactive terminal at all. So you can tell it that it doesn't get. You can control this by changing the user's shell, but this will achieve the same thing. You might decide that you don't want this, if this key is used, you don't want the person to be able to start up any and tunnel any X sessions back for graphical applications. And in this case, this is an example from a machine that uses Mon to do some remote graphing of CPU load and disk space and that kind of thing. And this particular user doesn't do anything else except for connecting to gather this information. So it needs to set up a tunnel on a particular port, which is opened up which appears as localhost on the remote machine. So you can tie down which ports it's allowed to open, so that it's only doing the things that you want it to do. And also you can restrict that key and connections made using that key to be allowed to use a specific command and nothing else. So if you're connecting in, syncing a backup across or whatever, you can do that, but it can't do anything else. So if the idea behind this is someone manages to get hold of a copy of that key, it just limits the amount of use they can do, the amount of damage they can do with it, because it's only useful from known locations, and it's only allowed to do things that you've already pre-decided are okay for it to do, nothing else. So the number of things they'd have to do to also be able to exploit that key becomes, quite a lot larger. So hopefully that will stop them from doing it. You can override the environment that the user gets when they connect using that key. This is a fairly simple example of changing the path, but you could set some other things that it needs depending on what task it's doing. I mean, apart from the tying it down to IP addresses, these are more useful with functional users rather than real sort of shell interactive accounts. But some of these things you might want to do just for convenience or rather than security, if you're connecting to certain particular machines to do particular tasks, even if they are interactive. Where we go? Yeah. If you're having some trouble, if you're trying to debug these settings, if you SSH in from the remote machine with the verbosity level set up, each time if you say SSH minus V, you can go minus V, minus V, minus V. Each time it turns up another level of verbosity, and they are marked, so you can filter them out and work out what's going on. So in this case, it checks the authorized keys file at the remote end, and it finds a typo. I think in this case it probably would allow the connection, but it does show up an error. So it's worth debugging these, even if the connection is going through. It may be because it's too loose, because it's now ignoring that because it's not meaningful. but it will check this file and it will throw up and it will tell you if the syntax is incorrect. Okay, so those are some things you can do to protect the authorized keys on the target machine. Now, there's some things as administrator on the remote server that you can change. Let's have a look at these. Yeah, this file is usually called SSH config, and in most distributions it's in etc SSH. Yeah, if the only slight difficulty with this, if you do have to restart the daemon every time you make a change. So depending on your distribution, this may be an init script or it may be a service restart. There'll be a script somewhere. Most distributions, I think, will give you the option to do it. Instead of saying restart, you can say try restart, which will check the syntax of the file and warn you if you've got any typos or what have you. This is useful because this is the point where it's quite possible to lock yourself out of the server. So it's worth checking this. And in fact, all that does, if you look at the script itself, it invokes the daemon with this argument, which basically says read the configuration file, and if there's any errors, return false. So you can just do a test for that. But as I said, there'll probably be a wrapper script that does that for you and gives you the option to test the configuration before you actually restart the daemon. The other thing is, if you're going to start, if this is a remote machine you haven't got physical access to, it's worth making sure that you have some means of getting back into it if you do manage to lock yourself out. If you've got serial access or the hardware comes with some kind of lights out management platform where you can get a virtual serial terminal up, or even if you temporarily run up if your filtering allows it, you could temporarily run up a telnet server or something, just in case you manage to lock yourself out of the SSH connection. It's a lot easier if you can just go in and reset it rather than having to walk somewhere far away. Okay, in this file again, all the defaults are in the file, but they're commented out, so you can see what the possible options are, or most of the possible options. First thing that I would check is I think certainly on recent versions of Debugging, permit root login is set to yes, which I always change to no, because unless I've got a very good reason for doing it, I don't want root SSHing in to the box, so it's worth checking that that's been set, unless you've got a good reason to do it. I'm not sure why it's the default on some, but so I don't think it is on all distributions. There's another thing you can turn on, which is strict modes, which I think it probably is on by default. And what this does is, if the file ownership permissions on the user that's connecting in, if their .ssh is subdirectory or any of the files in it are world readable, it will not allow the connection, or especially if the private key is not protected. So it's worth making sure that that's switched on. You may wish to allow X11 connections, as long as if you're aware of the fact that there are possible, because X is starting up lots of different displays and tunneling them backwards and forwards, there are potential exploits. But it may be in a trusted environment. You may have a machine that you run specific graphical applications on, and you may decide to allow that, but if you don't need it, it's always a good idea to turn it off. Again, you might, if you're not familiar with the SSH Agent, this is a program that you can fire up on your client, and then you can load in your individual keys before you connect to any hosts. The advantage of it is it's convenient, because you don't, and it also hopefully encourages you or the users to use long, complicated passphrases, because they don't have to type them in constantly. but you've got no way of auditing that. And there are dangers with SSH agent forwarding, especially as you can hop between hosts. So if you have the agent loaded up and you connect to one host, and you've got the public key installed on a subsequent host, you can then hop through to that host without having, and it builds a chain of trust back to the original agent, which if one of those machines on the way has been compromised or isn't under your control for some reason, there are dangers inherent in doing this. But again, you may, if you've got some local machines that you're connecting into a lot, you might decide it's worth doing that as long as you're aware of the possible drawbacks. I tend to, I've got a lot of functional machines where probably myself is the only user, and if I'm connecting in with keys, I tend to turn off password authentication after you've installed the keys, though, otherwise you may run into problems. So if you've got sort of machines, mail servers, file servers, where you've got a lot of ordinary users, you may not have the option politically to turn this off, because a lot of them seem to want to continue to use passwords. But that's a policy thing, really. So but it is possible to turn it off. And if it's a functional machine that you've got control over, there's only yourself and some other admins, then you can switch this off. Yes, one thing to be aware of, though, is that if by default PAM, which is the pluggable authentication module system, if that's enabled, which it may well be by default, you need to test whether or not turning off the previous option does actually mean that people can't connect in with passwords, because it's quite possible that, sorry.
I was just going to, you mentioned about some people complaining and stuff if you turn a password off. I was going to say, obviously there's match user and match group, so you could turn it off by default except for the special snowflakes, or turn it on by default except for people in the pseudo group or something.
Yeah. Hopefully there'll be
a slide on that.
But yes, so it's not, most of these things are not blanket because there are ways of overriding them now. So, what I was saying about this is it's worth double checking that although you've turned off password authentication at the SSH level, it's possible that PAM will authenticate them anyway. So it's just worth double checking that if you don't want this to be allowed, just make sure that it's not that's not coming through. Or you could configure PAM itself to give you the controls that you would like to have. Okay, so by default, any person with a valid system account can connect to the server, but you may not want that. So you can do allow users and deny users. And so we'll look at allow users first. So you can say allow users and give a username Bill, and this is exclusive. So at this point, if you're not Bill and you restart the daemon, you won't be able to get back in. But the advantage of doing this is if you've got a few accounts that you know ought to be allowed to SSH in, and there's lots of old system accounts and what have you that shouldn't be allowed to, this solves you having to worry about whether the shells are correct set up or anything like that, because it's only allowing the users that you've said that should be allowed in, which hopefully is, depending on the environment, may only be a small number. So you can specify more than one user in a list separated by spaces. You can, that's a bit small, but I think there's another slide coming up. The better control on this is if you give the username an @ and an IP address or a v6 IP address, that will only allow that user to connect from that host. And you can, for readability, if you've got logical groupings of people, you can split these across multiple lines. There we go. Yeah. Now, obviously, this is if you've got a machine that only has a small number of users that don't change very often, then that's fine. If you're having to, but obviously you do have to restart the daemon every time. So a slightly more flexible things if you do allow groups. So you could say you could set up a group for people who are allowed to SSH in to this machine, and then you can manage this with standard. It's just a standard Unix group in etc group. So you can manage that with the normal system tools, and you don't have to restart the daemon every time. No, you don't have to restart the daemon every time if you want to add a new user to that group. Yeah, so that's basically what that one says. You can combine the rules, and if you want to do that, it's deny first then allow, which is sensible, I think. Yeah. So you could have deny users, then allow users. I think this is the correct order. You can deny users, then it will then evaluate allow users. But because allow users is exclusive, you don't have to have a deny users unless the logic that you're trying to achieve needs that. And the same with the groups. So you can combine all these, but obviously you need to work out the logic correctly to make sure that it's actually achieving what you're after. Okay, they're also, you can override specific, the other commands that we looked at earlier on, you can change for given users. So there's a match operator. And this has, you can have several of these, but they have to be at the end of the file. So when it's evaluating them, it will stop when it reaches the next match or when it reaches the end of the file. So you have to put these at the end. So let's imagine we've turned off password authentication, but we've got a user here that we'd like to allow it for. So we can match on users. You can also match on groups, and you can negate these as well. Yeah, I think you can negate the match to users as well. You can match on addresses, so it's a slightly more sophisticated than just matching on doing a match user with an address on the end of it. So let's say that for some reason we want to allow password authentication from a particular address or block. We can do that, even though we've turned it off earlier on in the file. You can match on host names, and you can combine them. So you could say, you can combine them. So you can match on a user that you trust, and you can also these are ANDed together, I think, yes. And so say you've got a user who has got some graphical application they want to use, but you don't want anyone else to be able to use it, or to be able to run X at all, you can override that here. This is an example on well, it's on one of the actual servers we run. When I was looking for examples, so this is a Nagios user which connects into some of the hosts and attempts to does graphing of CPU load, etc. In this case, we wanted it to use a key. We wanted it not to be allowed to use password. And the other thing you can do here, if you get sometimes when you're setting up automated users and it's not working, you may get a message asking you if your shell is clean. And what that normally means is that something, either the user's shell or the system itself, is printing out some text, which is confusing the connection. So you can turn off the banner, which if you've got a banner, you can turn that off here. You can do basically host user-specific things here. What else have we got here? Yeah, one thing I found you can do when I was checking through the man pages to do these slides, you can, which I didn't realise you could do, you can chroot SFTP. So in the olden days when we still used FTP, some of the daemons allowed you to create a chroot jail, which meant that the users connect in to their own account and they had their own version of a minimal set of static binaries so that they could look at files and copy them around but not do anything else dangerous. Well, you can do this with SFTP. I haven't actually tried this, but I will. So normally SFTP is fired up with a declaration, a subsystem declaration here, which allows it to fire up the SFTP daemon. SFTP is syntactically very, very similar to FTP, but it's a lot more secure. And basically, yes, you replace the normal subsystem command with one that ties it down into an internal one, and then back you then use a match stanza, which allows so it turns off X11, turns off the forwarding, and this force command stanza here is similar in some ways to the command you can put in for tying down keys. This means that this user has to, as soon as they connect, whatever command you put here is run. So in this case, they fire up the subsystem for SFTP, and it gives them a UID that's fixed, and it does a chroot directory to their home. So that may or may not be useful. What else we got? Oh, okay. You can also jail shell accounts, but obviously that's a bit more work because you've got to set up a static environment for them to connect to each other, otherwise they won't be able to run anything because they won't have access to the normal paths. You can do some rate limiting, so I'll look at quickly. In the old days, you could just say that you would only allow 10 unauthenticated connections before it started dropping them. But now you can say that after a certain threshold, you start dropping a certain percentage. And then the last value there is when you hit that many unauthenticated connections, you start dropping all of them. Yeah, troubleshooting. So the standard is just log level info, so you can increase that, and you can run SSH with lots and lots of extra debugging. I can't read that either. And depending on how your syslog's set up, it'll probably appear in the auth log, or yeah, you can check your syslog to find out where it ends up. Okay, so and you should get a meaningful user telling you that the user wasn't, why it failed. So that's quite easy. You can go and debug that. Yeah, that was a password thing. Okay, and that is the end.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Got 2 minutes for questions.
I noticed you mentioned ProFTPD back there. I didn't know if you know, but there's actually a Mon SFTP for that, so you can use ProFTPD to run an SFTP service.
Oh, right.
We actually do this at work for transferring files to client, because what you can do is you can get it to run everybody as a single Unix user. They're not actually real Unix users, which makes me feel a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah.
Because it means that they haven't got real logins in our system, if you see what I mean. So, but anyway, I was just excited to put that out there.
Yeah, that's useful. Yeah.
The second last slide there, and one before it showed quite useful information to somebody attacking your system. Can you tell SSHD not to respond with why the
that's in the SSHD logs, not in the server logs, not the client.
that's in the syslog.
Yeah, that's if you're debugging it and you're connecting in, trying to work out why you can't connect to the server. But I don't know the answer to that other question. If you can actually change the verbosity downwards, I suppose you probably can change it down to author. I think that's what it's set to debug rather than info, which you'd probably want to turn off again after you've solved whatever problem you're looking at. So, yeah, yeah.
I had another one. You mentioned earlier about turning off ham so it wouldn't do password authentication sort of through keyboard interactive. Have you done much with the later versions of OpenSSH support multi-factor authentication, to specify multiple authentication methods? Do you have to pass all of them? Have you done much with that?
No, I haven't really looked at that, but I think that's something. I mean, there are some other ways of having sort of two-factor or multi-factor, which are, rather than just having something you have and something you know, rather than some actual. Yeah, I think that would be useful to look at in the future. Yeah.
You talked before about about the forwarding, SSH agent forwarding. And one of the things I've used in the past is to SSH into a machine and then netcat through a tunnel back to the original machine onto the machine I want to get to, and then SSH through that. So you can do that in one line inside your SSH config file, which if you do that rather than the agent forwarding, you're still authenticating from the original machine, but there's nothing that a man in the middle can do.
Right.
Because you're actually SSHing from the original machine. All you're using the second machine for is to set up the tunnel that is going to encapsulate the second SSH connection.
Okay.
Yes, a number of there was a few years of various break-ins to big open source projects. SourceForge had security issues, and that
Debian got
boiled
done
down
with
to
the forwarding.
compromised machine. If you SSH into it with a forwarded agent, you can lift the full copy of the key out of it,
Right.
which is the big. So you never SSH to a machine with agent forwarding that you don't trust. Otherwise, you can.
And why do you trust any machine? Especially if it's one that is a gateway to all of the other ones. That's the one that people are going to compromise.
Yes. Thank you, David. We have run out of time, and a small gift for you. Thank you for speaking.
Thank you.
Quarter your confectionery.